This is Moments of Truth, the webcast with and for customer success professionals. I'm your host, Andrew Marks, co-founder of Success Hacker. Today, I'm joined by Rav Dhaliwal. Rav is an investor and venture partner with Crane Venture Partners based in the UK. He's held several executive positions in various enterprise software companies over the last 20 years, most recently at Slack as their head of EMEA customer success. Rav built and led post-sales support, professional services, and customer success business units at Zendesk and Yammer, and has published several books on enterprise software deployment. Rav, welcome to the program, and thanks for making time for me today.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's great to be here, and been really looking forward to our conversation this afternoon.
Likewise. So, Rav, in the subscription economy, it's imperative to build the right commercial engine promptly once you've achieved product market fit. And failure to do so is a common reason why early stage software companies struggle. Being able to consistently articulate, position, sell, and deliver on your product's value sets you on a path to scale your business rapidly. And scaling your business is more than just hiring people and mapping out your process, implementing some systems, and adding logos to your customer page. This is also a point where the customer success function is typically created all too often, though, as a knee-jerk reaction, with the assumption that that team will become the catch-all for all things customer-focused and then end up being perceived as the sole team responsible for customer growth and value realization, basically the everything department. And that's a dangerous and slippery slope for your CS team, the rest of your organization, and most importantly, your customer base. Now, in November of 2020, you authored a blog post on this very subject for Scottish Equity Partners, where you're an external advisor. Given your experience as both an operational executive and an investor, I'd love to dive deeper into this phenomenon and talk about how to assess the many risks that are associated with falling into this trap, how to avoid it from happening, and how to fix this situation if you're living it right now.
Yeah, you really articulated the sort of the article there really succinctly, Andrew. So thank you so much for that. I would say I think what's really interesting is, and certainly from having been in the CS profession and now spending a lot of time helping founders think through how they're going to build functions like CS, what's really sort of clear to me is the root cause of some of these challenges, actually the root cause of all of these challenges, is that there's a very important missing part to sales. And this may sound rather strange, given that, just about every aspect of building and running a software company has been studied, measured, systematized, programmatized, backed up by software, and sales more so than any other part. But if we were to take a modern scaling software as a service subscription-based software company and compare that company to a company 25 years ago that was building on-premises perpetually licensed software, what we would find actually is those two companies are really roughly pretty much organized the same way. They're not too much difference. We would have a production line of marketing and engineering and support and sales and so on. And if we did drill down into the sales organizations of our contemporary SaaS startup and our historical 25-year-old on-premises software company, the sales organizations would be very familiar, largely recognizable to us. So they would have their own production line of pipeline generation, qualification, pilots, proof of concepts, negotiation, deal closure. And this is actually the challenge, because the way we sell software hasn't, despite the fact we have dramatically in the last 25 years changed how we develop, distribute, sell, and consume software, we actually haven't really, in essence, changed much about how we sell it. And so what we've taken is a model that was designed for on-premises perpetual license selling and supplanted that model into subscription-based SaaS companies, right? And so what that's really resulted in is founders, and founders now are typically, by and large, mostly from the product, technical, and engineering worlds. Back 25 years ago, you could only get investment money if you came from sales or marketing. So the nature of founders have changed. The founders rely very heavily on their ecosystem of advisors and consultants and their investors and their peers to say, well, how do I build a commercial organization? And the orthodoxy is, well, build it this way, build it the way we've always built it. And the problem with that is that way we've sold software typically involves two types of selling, which is inbound selling. People come to me, I qualify them, are they a good fit? I try to convert them. And then outbound selling, I build an organization to go and find prospective customers, engage with them and convert them. And that model, inbound and outbound selling, moved into the SaaS world, is missing a third really vital component. There's inbound selling, there's outbound selling, and there's continuous selling. So in a subscription business, we are continually selling because the customer is not perpetually licensed. They own the license for maybe a month if it's an MRR business, or maybe a year typically. And so we have to continue to sell to them in order to make sure not only do we retain the revenue we secured with them, that we get more revenue, right? So that is the problem. Structurally, we sell software the same way we always have, in this very orthodox way, and it's missing this idea of continual sales. So where companies have run into problems in the modern era, in the SaaS era, so let's say the last 15, 20 years, is when they start to see signs that they're closing customers, but these customers have a lot of very sort of unmet or unanticipated needs, and they're scrabbling to service those needs. And that's because, you know, they're growing at such a scale and a pace, as you mentioned in the introduction, that they're hitting customers now that are like, oh, there aren't owners for some of the things that these customers need. So the solution, and this was obviously pioneered by Salesforce, is we'll build a customer success function. That function will undertake to do all the things that aren't met or have been unanticipated, and that gives us a best shot at retaining that revenue. And people forget that the reason Salesforce stepped in a very, very big way and made a big capital expenditure in building success was to try and stem the tide of 8% churn.
Right, 8% churn, 8% churn, not a year, 8% churn a month.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Purely a reactive thing, very sensible. Now, if you fast forward to now, you can't make that kind of capital expenditure anymore. It's just not possible, right? So what you've then now got is a function who historically has been viewed as a revenue defensive function, not a growth function, and a function that's become a catch-all for lots of other things that don't fit anywhere. Now, the reason it's become a catch-all, you talked about it earlier, Andrew, it's because it's created out of a reaction to things. But it's also because, this is maybe a separate conversation for another time, there isn't really still an industry standard definition for CS. It's very contextual from a company to company. So if you're in a SaaS company, a modern SaaS company, and you have a feeling we might be trying to deal with a lot of unmet or unanticipated needs, the signs of that are things like, well, you know, you're getting good at closing customers and selling to them, but getting them deployed or onboarded is either taking a very long time or it's not happening. Or if we do get them onboarded, the adoption of the platform is really poor. Some instances you do a lot of good work and CS figures out how to get people to use the product, but then another manifestation is they're not using the product in a particularly sophisticated way. The product's very capable, they're only using very basic capabilities. Some other signs are that, you know, the customer just doesn't advocate for you, right? So they're not telling their peers and colleagues about you. They're not maybe internally advocating adoption. They're certainly not doing references. And finally, the key sign that you're having these unanticipated needs is, going back to the Salesforce example, loss of revenue, right? You're either losing renewal revenue or you're not gaining any substantial growth revenue. And so if you are having those symptoms, it's tempting to then go create a customer function. But if it's done out of that reaction, as you pointed out, it's really not adding a ton of value to both your customers or your own business. It's simply there as a reactive everything department.
Wow, there's a lot of stuff that you threw out there to unpack. And I want to talk about, I really want to kind of go down the path of figuring out, okay, how do I know that I'm there? How do I assess this? How do I avoid it? What can I do? I've been waxing poetic for years about how the software business has evolved, but the way that we deliver that as an organization, as well as the incentives that are in place, are very on-prem. They're all based off of that on-prem.
Go back even further, Andrew, which is, if you look at the way almost all modern businesses are organized, we're all familiar with the org chart. The org chart is entirely an invention of the industrial era. So, from the early 20th century, in fact, I believe it was an invention of a gentleman called Frederick Winslow Taylor, who wrote a famous book called The Principles of Scientific Management. And his Taylorism, as it's called, was really about looking at the manufacture of objects which typically required, artisans and craftsmen, and deconstructing the manufacturing into lots of smaller, unskilled jobs that could be done at high volume. So the worker only ever really needed to know how to do their bit.
Right.
They didn't know how the bit before them worked or the bit after. But in order to make sure all of this ran efficiently, you needed this hierarchy above the worker to coordinate everything. And that's really why companies are organized the way they are. So that's kind of just a historical precedent. Now, we do need that structure because as we get bigger, we need to have a structure that supports efficiency and predictability and repeatability.
Right.
But as you point out, if we try to apply that to software, which is fundamentally not manufacturing, it's intangible in terms of what we're producing, it's code, and try to apply the same structure, and we don't get the incentivization right.
Right.
So we incentivize one group for shipping code, one group for driving marketing qualified leads, one group for driving ACV, and then one group at the end. And typically success has 6 or 7 metrics,
right,
which is again a further manifestation of it's at the end of this production line and it's owning everything that didn't fit anywhere else.
Right.
That is a recipe. Maybe for short term you'll be okay, but for long term, structurally, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And that's because we do have enough runway and data to understand that every single very successful SaaS company gets the vast majority of its revenue, new revenue, from its existing customer base.
Right.
And that typically, in Salesforce's case, that started happening in year 5, not year 15.
Right.
So it happens reasonably quickly. So you've got to lay down this foundation of continuous selling from day one. You have to not be thinking, right, I've optimized for sales because that's what the orthodox sales process for software tells me. You have to optimize for the first sale and then build a machine that maximizes your chance for the next sale and the next sale.
Right. 100% on board with that. We embraced that. We launched an outcome-based selling program last year,
great,
where customer success becomes part of that. There's a blend. There's an overlap, and we're thinking about things not as a single transaction, but we're playing the long game. Everybody needs to be playing the long game. Yeah. Marketing and sales and engineering and product and customer success, we all need to be aligned and playing the long game for the customer. So how do you assess that you're at that point, or that you're walking into a situation with that point, where you've become part of, or your group is becoming the everything?
Yeah, interesting. And I guess it's really hard for CS teams to sometimes have the luxury of stepping back and thinking about it, because they are so busy doing. They are so busy owning everything. And so this is by no means exhaustive, but I think some of the signals one should look out for is, first of all, does the success function actually have a cogent, crisp definition of its mission and how it's adding value?
Right.
And when I say that, it's not, oh, we're the customer's trusted advisor or we drive outcomes. It's here's the skill that we bring to speed up the value, and that adds revenue to our company.
What's the purpose of what we're doing here?
Why do we exist? We bring digital change management skills to accelerate value for our customers, so we add to our net revenue retention, right? Does you have a mission?
Right.
And related to that, I mentioned net revenue retention. Does the team have materially important targets? So are you all focused on a North Star target that's materially important to your company? Now, in the early stages of your company, where revenue may not be so important because you're still in the early stages, brand awareness and brand loyalty may be the number one North Star for the company. So you should have a target like NPS, etc., that leads to that. But later, as you've established that awareness and you're building that commercial organization, your focus really needs to be, how do we get customers seeing value quickly? So maybe time to value is the right measure there. Right. And eventually, as a company starts to get its product market fit and go to market fit and is putting the foot on acceleration, it's all about revenue. So, at that stage, the CS team hopefully understands what skill set they need to bring to bear, what engagements add fast value, and how we can get customers to fast value. And then it should all be about net revenue retention. Right. How much revenue are we retaining and how much are these customers expanding by? And I think once you've had those, you've got those materially important targets in place, data really comes into play. So do you actually have the ability to make decisions about your customers that are informed by data? So rather than just saying, here are the 10 engagements we do with customers, can you actually correlate the value of what you're doing to usage outcome, right? If we do X, does it move the needle, with usage or proficiency? Right. And CS teams, and I think companies in general, struggle with getting enough data. Now, I'm talking to a whole bunch of entrepreneurs that are building for this problem, which is great. But again, you've really got to be on top of your data. And then going back to the earlier part of our conversation, Andrew, is the key signs that you may be in an everything department is you have little to no alignment with the sales organization, or you have just a very hard handover from sales. So, something happens, you get a ticket, you get a notification, hey, we've closed this customer. That's probably one of the key signs that you're sitting at the end of this production line running a whole bunch of stuff you probably shouldn't be. And I would round that off by saying that, it's increasingly important to have input and have a strong relationship and communication with the product organization. So if you've got no formal feedback mechanism between CS and product, that's also generally another sign you might be seeing in an everything department.
If you don't have a formal feedback loop with marketing, right? As you learn more about your customer base and how the ideal customer profile has evolved, because they're the ones that are responsible for generating those quality leads. And if those quality leads, in fact,
it's even more important to be able to feed back to marketing. These are the characteristics of customers that don't see value. Yes. Because then we may need to rethink our ideal customer profile or how we're targeting them or how we're selling to them. If you think about, we talked about this organizational structure and history. If you think about the SaaS company as a production line, and sales is part of that production line, CS is right at the end of it, and it is often tasked with dealing with problems or trying to work around defects that happen further back in the production line.
Right.
So in the example of, if we were building cars, you're saying to the person at the end of the car in the showroom, you got to deliver this car to the customer on time, number one. You've got to teach them how to drive our car. Our car is slightly different from everybody else's. Right. While you're doing that, you got to kind of resolve any defects that occurred in manufacturing or assembly, or even design. Then try and actually get them to buy some add-on features for the car, leather seats, rear view camera, and get them to come back next year and buy another car.
And buy another one, exactly.
Yeah, right. And I don't know anyone who can do.
No, I love the analogy of the manufacturing line. It very much looks that way. In customer success, though, we actually talk about customer success needs to be approached as a manufacturing line of sorts, but it's a continuous manufacturing line. Having a predictable, repeatable approach to delivering success drives efficiency, drives consistency, improves quality.
And everybody in that production line needs to have a portion of what they're aiming for be based on long-term value for the customer. So,
yes, it's all
marketing, product, engineering. So rather than incent engineers on shipping a feature by a certain date, why don't we incent them on how much usage that feature?
Yes, why don't we incent them on adoption? If not just incenting salespeople on getting them in the door, right? We need to incent them on getting them in the door and how long they stay. Right? Customer lifetime value.
Getting them in the door and making sure they've got this kind of usage profile within the first 60 days.
Right. Yep.
So I think part of the problem with all of this is just how we name things, right? If we didn't call sales, if we let's say we called sales, but if we called customer success the growth team, because that's what they're really trying to do.
Right.
Then that might start to alter the perception of what they do. Because if you have a function called customer success, it creates a conscious and unconscious view in everyone else's mind in the company. Anything to do with customers belongs there, right?
Right.
If you actually want to have a sales team and then have a growth team, just that, I think, for a first-time founder, explaining that to them, that would actually help to get onto this idea of continuous sales. Oh, I get it. I sell to people, then I focus on growing them. The second part of that focus on growing them, and this is something I spend a lot of time talking to founders with. I said, well, how do you sell? And they go, well, we have a salesperson. And who works with that salesperson? Well, we have a technical person, sometimes a person from engineering, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so then what happens? Well, then we hand it to the success team. Okay, so what do? Well, they, onboard, launch, deal with problems, sort manufacturing defects out, and then they expand the customer. And I said, well, how do they do that? He said, well, what do you mean? I go, it took two people to sell to this customer, a commercial person and a technical one. You gave this to a technical group to work with the customer, yet somehow they can do the sales bit as well. And then normally there's silence, because that's when the founder realizes, oh, I don't know who commercially owns the customer after we sold them the first time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the gap. So CS can't do this on its own. It has to be paired up either with an existing commercial organization, the people who did the first sale, or another commercial organization tasked with growing new revenue from the customer. So you need two people to sell and you need two people to grow.
It's even more nuanced than that. Okay. So customer success is responsible for creating an environment where a renewal and expansion and upsell can occur. That is done through value realization. That is done through helping you get $1.05, $1.10, $1.15 out of every dollar that you've invested with us.
And preferably as quickly as possible.
As quickly as possible. Exactly. And then there's somebody within that team, or like you said, back in the sales team, who should care about that and is going to be responsible for taking that customer through the commercial piece of this, right? Yeah. And what you do is you end up allowing the customer success team to maintain that trusted advisor relationship, that value realization kind of view that the customer has, and you don't risk them thinking, oh, they're just trying to sell me something else.
Well, I mean, I would go even a step further. You need to sell a customer and then to grow them, someone who is responsible for the commercial well-being of that customer and someone who's responsible for the product well-being of that customer.
The value
you need both of those skills.
Yep.
If you try to embody both of those skills in one person, you're going to be very hard pushed to find people who can do both really, really well.
100%.
So I would completely agree with you. All of this comes back to what we talked about at the top of our interview here today, Andrew, is we're using a sales model that was developed for a completely different era of software distribution purchasing. That was when people bought software as a capital expenditure.
Right.
I bought it and I was perpetually licensed. I had to buy the servers, the data centers, the racks, the backup tanks.
And the vendor got 80-90% of that budget right up front.
So quite rightly, sales's job then was considered done at contract signature.
Right.
That was right.
Yep.
Now we are not in that mechanism anymore.
No.
People rent the software from us.
Yep.
Generally don't have to make a giant capital expenditure. It's an operating expenditure.
Yep.
Yet we want this magic to happen with growth, except we're telling the salespeople your mindset of saying your job is done when contract is signed. Right. That's fine. That still holds true.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we haven't changed the incentives, so they're acting.
And by the way, I'm not criticizing sales. They're doing exactly what they've been asked to do.
Exactly. This is not a. We're not trashing sales here. This is they are doing exactly what they've been asked to do and what they're incented to do.
Exactly.
And the problem is that the incentives are misaligned with what our objectives are, right? Yeah. And incentives drive behavior.
And that's because we have three types of selling: inbound, outbound, continuous.
Yes.
And hardly anyone is thinking about how to build a continuous sales motion. What they're trying to do is say, I'll create a function that will manage all of the stuff that's left over from trying to fit the old sales model into the new world.
Right. Which is what you said earlier. You've got these engineer leaders, CEOs, CPOs, and they're talking to their investors, and more times than not, who have been they're investors now because they were in the business 20 years ago, right? And they've been able to move, into roles with in venture capital and investment. Yet they're basing their recommendations off of what they did, and it's a different world now.
I think that to that point, then obviously now, as an investor, you see more and more operators, people like me, becoming investors, but also you're seeing a greater understanding, especially like in the firms you mentioned up front, Crane and Scottish Equity Partners. There is a greater understanding of firms that are forward thinking like those two, that actually our job is to create predictable, sustainable revenue. So how can we help them figure out the conundrum of selling, but in a sustainable way?
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference. And those funds are the ones that will mint the next series of very, very successful companies, because they will be building. It is much easier to scale a company to great heights from a foundation of very stable revenue than it is to scale it while you're trying to fix churn issues, because that becomes almost impossible.
Yeah, exactly. It's like trying to change the engines on a plane while it's in flight. It's really difficult to do, right? So we talked about some of the signs that you may be slipping into that, or you're there. And I think it's probably for a lot of companies, especially a lot of customer success leaders, are probably feeling a lot of that when you're there, right? How do you fix this? Especially if you're not the CEO. Let's say you're maybe you're not even chief customer officer. You're a VP of customer success. Yeah. And you are now feeling like, oh my God, I am the everything department. What do you suggest how these people can approach addressing this? It's not something that they're going to fix, but they're going to need to address it in the right way.
I'm going to be very conscious about the fact that I'm speaking from the luxurious position of not having to push that giant boulder up a hill every day.
Right, yeah.
So my grandfather used to have the saying is that the worst vice is advice, is what he used to say, right? So I'm not going to even profess to give any leaders out there advice, but what I can do is share from you some of my learning of what I found worked, and I can talk about how hard it was. I think the first thing, going back to some of those signs, is you really got to have a very crisp definition of what your CS team is there, why, what it sits, why. And it's got to be in very plain, simple language with a materially important outcome. So if you can, everybody, without having it explained to them, can tell you what sales does. Right. Everyone has experienced sales in their normal life. Salespeople get on the phone and ask strangers for money. Everybody understands that, right? Marketing is reasonably well understood. We run campaigns to get customers to come to us, right? People understand these things. what does customer success do? If you have a response like, well, I'm a trusted advisor, or I drive outcomes, or I'm blah, blah, something kind of very generic and strategic, people won't understand that. But if you say, I bring DevOps product skill to the customer so we can drive more net revenue retention from them, right? Everyone can understand that, right? I'm a net revenue driving engine, and I've told you how I do it, right? So that's the first thing. Have a very crisp elevator pitch. Make sure you have some material targets that are important to the company that you can report on, whether that's NRR, whether it's time to value, whatever it is important to the company, you need to be drawing a line between the work you're doing and those numbers. And do not be afraid to own a number. There is a reason why sales is important, because they own that number. So own a number. Make sure you have access to the data and signals from your customers that lets you stay on top of your business. So not only to correlate the effectiveness of your work, but also to make sure that you are able to get proactive signals of whether things are going well or badly. Leading indicators of success. Can you define a set of usage characteristics you want to get every customer to, and get the signals for that? And I think the two most important things, get integrated into the sales motion. That's easier said than done. There should be nothing stopping you looking at the pipeline and nothing stopping you looking at the top 10 deals that are about to close and going and speaking to your VP sales. Tell me about these deals. Tell me about the stakeholder. Get me an introduction.
Right.
We need to start work on this right now.
Yeah, we got to get you got to get the success team integrated into the tail end of the sales process, right?
I don't want to be spending the next 2 months doing customer discovery. I want that done, and I want the customer ready to roll on contract signature. Related to that, and this is somewhat slightly out of a CS leader's hands, but it's something you can push for, and well, half of it is out of your hands. Make sure CS is aligned in exactly the same way that sales is. If sales is aligned by industry vertical, align your team that way. If it's aligned by geography, align it that way. However it's aligned, make sure it's the same, because what you want to do is pod sales, SE and CS people together on a common book of business so they run their own business. The bit you can't necessarily control is having incentive alignment. So making sure part of sales and CS comp overlaps. That is a thing that you would fight up the chain to make sure that that happens. And as I always say to founders, you'll know that's the right thing when the head of sales pushes back on it. Then you'll know it's the right thing to do. And then finally is spend the time to understand how you can help the product team, how best they like feedback. I think CS teams sometimes get frustrated because they go, I'm sending these product feature requests and nothing happens. If you go and talk to a product manager, they go, feature requests are no good to me. I need problem statements. Tell me what the business problem is. Tell me what the pain the customer is experiencing. Tell me the impact of that pain. Don't come to me with a solution. We will work on the solution, right? So I think I would probably prioritize those.
Make sure you're providing color commentary. Make sure you're providing its context and content. It's, you know, all those details.
There's nothing as unhelpful to a product person as a feature request. It's just not, it's not helpful.
No, those are all great. Those are all great points.
And I would just add one last thing to that is, I think the thing that helps most of all is to understand and accept that you actually have two customers. You have the customers your team is working with that are paying you money, and everyone else internally is a customer, right? And so as a leader, you need to be making as much effort on the internal change management and engagement of your internal customer as your team is doing with your external, because this doesn't just work once. You have to do this like a program and keep on doing it.
Exactly. 100% agree. 100% agree. And you've got a follow-up post to that SCP post you did, where you're going to talk about more of this?
So I've been fleshing out this idea of continuous selling and trying to define it and trying to present a lot of the historical context actually we've talked about today, because what I found is that when you talk to founders, you talk to leaders, and you explain the history behind things, it helps them to realize the situation they're in right now.
Yeah.
And then you can introduce something like, well, actually, this is why we need to think about creating a continuous selling motion or continuous sales. So that is hopefully something I'll be finishing in the next couple of weeks, and I'll be very happy to share it with you, Andrew, and the rest of the listeners when it's ready. I'll post it up on Medium and on LinkedIn, on my sort of usual favorite haunts.
Yeah,
and
we'd love to actually. We'd love to get that. We'd love to get that as well as the SEP post on our site as well. So
yeah,
we should talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I would be inclined to do is, although we're talking about continuous selling, I'm kind of hopefully preaching to the converted. If people do read this article, send it to your sales leaders, send it to your sales colleagues. Yeah. It's written for them, because at the end of the day, if you move to a continuous selling motion, it's going to make it that much easier for them to hit their number.
Yeah, exactly. Excellent. Rav, thank you. I know it's late for you over there in the UK.
It's my turn to cook dinner, Andrew, so I can talk for another couple of hours.
All right. Well, hey, wonderful to talk to you and see you again. Great topic. I think people are really going to enjoy watching and or listening to this, and hopefully we can do this again sometime soon.
It'll be my absolute pleasure. Thanks again, Andrew, for inviting me on, and it's been great fun, and stay safe.
You too. Stay safe and healthy.
Take care. Bye-bye.